Each comparative studies field has its own set of key constructs or target variables that deserve scrutiny. But as in many comparative contexts, the variation in the units, environments, or levels being compared makes it quite clear that there are always problems with comparisons. One way to overcome this obstacle is to decide on a way forward. I suggest that one way would be to ask several key questions about comparative studies or comparative methodologies to begin with. For example, are comparative methodologies consistently defined and measured? We could, if we wanted, begin with the sessions on comparative education, comparative psychology, and comparative religion that are being held on the first day of the symposium. Of course, each paper that's presented gives us an important study that we should value on its own merit, but we can also look across the many papers being presented and start thinking about whether the comparative methods that each researcher is using are consistently defined and measured. If they are, then how are they? If they aren't, then what are the variations? And in either case, why are they alike or different? Are there some trends in context, topic, or data that suggest how and why the comparative methods discussed are defined and measured? Or we could look specifically at comparative methodologies by asking, are comparative methodologies context, discipline, or field specific, or do comparative methodologies lend themselves to cross-contextual, interdisciplinary, or multi-level analyses? As these questions suggest, cultural, contextual, and organizational characteristics often prevent direct comparisons, but examining various social science phenomena and comparative studies fields by looking at them comparatively allows for a holistic approach to understanding rather than trying to achieve understanding as a conglomeration of isolated phenomena. Now, little comparative work has examined how the different comparative studies fields handle this obstacle to comparison. As Skocpol and Summers in 1980 wisely observed, certain areas of scholarly endeavor in contemporary social science have given rise to methodological reflection even more sophisticated than the substantive applications of the methods in question. But this has certainly not been the case for comparative history. Despite the steady application of variants of this approach to macro-social topics such as revolutions, religious evolution, political development, economic modernization, patterns of collective violence, and the rise and fall of empires, there have been remarkably few efforts to explore the methodological aspects of comparative history as such in any systematic fashion. So to be more systematically reflected in our comparative approach, we can begin by asking the questions outlined already, which address consistency in definition and measurement and specific versus integrated approaches to comparison. But the most basic way to compare comparative methodologies is to consider the levels or units of comparison being used. And if we were to systematically address the details of a comparative method, in Skocpol and Summers' case, comparative history, we will often find that levels of comparison and units of comparison are often the most predictive and reliable when they are focused or contained. In other words, broader levels of analysis, like global comparisons, are often less stable comparative units than more focused levels of analysis, such as neighborhoods or families or individuals. But we could begin comparing comparative studies by grouping comparative methodologies. This gives us a place to start because it shows us which methodologies look alike and how they are dissimilar from other families of methodologies. In other words, we could maybe group a comparative historical method with other methods that might also look at macro-social topics. Now, that's no easy task, and I know that, but it would be bound to make a big impact if we could start to look for families of methodologies within comparative studies, broadly speaking. Now, for one thing, few activities and behaviors are centrally coordinated worldwide. And since the context of comparative study is one of the most important yet misunderstood influences on comparative research in all fields, a cross-disciplinary comparison aims to build a conceptual framework for comparing comparative methodologies across the many fields of comparative study. And to do this, the capacity for understanding and identifying the comparative method in various fields truly is necessary. And to sustain comparative collaboration and mutual benefit, comparative analysis must build a reflective, interdisciplinary, and scholarly base for continued awareness, development, and application of comparative methods in really all fields. And that would be the beginning of a science of comparison for comparative methodologies themselves. So what exactly is the comparative method? Well, in the late 1960s, two professors of comparative education named Harold Noah and Max Eckstein set out to develop a science of comparative education. They began by tracing the historical development of comparative education to set the foundational context for comparative ed as a scientific research method. And I believe that there's common understanding that that was a very strong start. But their fatal flaw, so to speak, was that their answer to creating a science of the comparative method in education was to simply apply the classic procedures of the scientific method to comparative education research. In other words, they argued that comparative education researchers should first set up hypotheses, second, collect data, third, quantify, control, manipulate, and interpret the analysis of the data, and then fourth, blend compatible hypotheses in order to constitute a theory about whatever phenomenon had just been investigated. And the problem is that this approach was never going to be flexible enough to handle all of the vagaries of context and time and culture and purpose that comparative methodologies require. In fact, the better approach seems to be to start big and then gently focus as the situation, data, or questions allow. Now, in a study of the promise and pitfalls of comparative research design in migration studies, sociologist Irene Blomrad said that comparative research design involves a decision over what to compare and how to compare. She said that the what involves deciding on a general class of cases in a study. The how is a choice about the comparative logics that drive the selection of specific cases. In contrast to Noah and Eckstein's overly specified scientific approach to comparative method, Blomrad's generalism is a great way to begin systematically and holistically understanding the comparative method. And we simply start with two questions. What do we compare? And how do we compare it? If we already know that what we want to compare is comparative methodologies themselves, then all we're left with is the how, right? Well, not exactly. We all know that it takes more than what and how to understand a phenomenon. We need to know who, what, when, where, why, and how, and that's just to get started. Then we can start asking more complicated questions. For example, how about going one step back and beginning by asking, when is comparison appropriate? And when is it comparing apples and oranges, or apples and pears, depending on which translation you're working with? In other words, when are we comparing things that weren't meant to be compared? The answer depends on a lot of different factors, including unit, which we've already talked about a little bit, context, interpretation, and then application of the comparative method. And Blomrad seems to realize that it is a more complex problem than just deciding on what and how, as well, when she says, a little later on after this quote, that the strength of a comparative research design rests on its ability to foster concept building, theory building, and the identification of causal mechanisms. In other words, our theoretical perspective or conceptual framework will shift the who, what, when, where, why, and how of comparing methodologies just as much as the connections and differences among them does, if not more. Another comparativist, political scientist Thomas Dink, pushes us beyond theory and into the realm of empirical comparative methodology when he asserted that a classic problem in comparative studies has been the presence of too many variables and too few cases. In other words, he's saying it's hard to compare when we only have a handful of cases that we're looking at. Additionally, the instruments of comparison require careful scrutiny to ensure that they are valid and reliable tools for comparison. And at this point, maybe we're coming back around to the how of comparing comparative methodologies, but perhaps more importantly, we can ask if it's possible to move beyond the classic empirical and disciplinary distinctions between qualitative and quantitative comparisons that sociologist Charles Reagan created for comparativists in 1987 in his widely read book, The Comparative Method. One way to do that is to ask if comparative science implies a universality of methodology or not. The scope of comparison studies across all of the social science disciplines encompasses comparisons at all levels of analysis, from micro to meso to macro. And there are some reasons why comparative studies are still stuck then at the international or cross-national comparison arena.